a nation of teenagers searching for an identity after 236 years. It hasn't grown up. And it's this kind of man-child landscape, tripping too much over our religious beliefs, even today, to be able to walk into a gallery that can openly display nudity or, nobody yet as an artist has painted a gigantic massacre scene of what happened only 180 years ago on this continent.
Good morning, and welcome back to 5 a.m. Story Talk, a place to talk about stories in all their forms, the craft that goes into them, and the role that art plays in our lives. I'm Cole Haddon, screenwriter, novelist, podcaster, really a storytelling jack of all trades at this point in my life. And today I'm going to be joined by one of my favorite contemporary Australian artists, First Nations artist Blak Douglas. For those who might need help with the language, First Nations is one of several ways to refer to Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the land's traditional custodians, but also the oldest continuous culture on Earth, stretching back 65,000 years. For context, humans haven't even been in North and South America for 20,000 years. Before I get into who Blak is, I think I need to remind you, my good listeners, that despite the fact that my accent is American, I left the country after the 2016 US election. I live in my mother's home country of Australia now. Because of this, I know more than a little about its history, but odds are you don't. That's why today's intro, this faux fireside chat I'm having with you right now, is going to be a bit longer than usual. Don't worry, I'll try to make the history lesson interesting, or at least horrifying, because it is. When Europeans established their first colony in what we call Australia today, this was back in 1788, there were hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations living here in peace. Things did not go well for the First Nations population, to say the least. By the 20th century, a white-only policy was in full effect, with the intent of segregating First Nations people from the white population, and even going so far as to steal children from their families to help wipe out their ancestral culture and traditions. We call these kids the stolen generation today. There's another name for this, of course. That's genocide, though I don't hear white Australians refer to it as much all that often. Now, a lot of work has gone into confronting the disgusting sins of the European culture that conquered the continent. But to this day, Australia remains the only government in the world not to strike a treaty with its Indigenous peoples. Blak Douglas's work is a direct response to centuries of such crimes against humanity and an ongoing cry for a more leftist reimagining of the country's political identity. He admits things have improved over the past few decades, but there's a long way to go, so the struggle continues. Today, Aussies try to deal with their past by showing appropriate respect to the peoples that Europeans stole the continent from and then tried to, eradicate. One of the ways of doing this is to acknowledge country. Country being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, which all of Australia is. I typically include this acknowledgement in the show notes, which I know is an imperfect answer to what might be expected of me given that I live and work here. But I've made the decision that this is an international podcast with an international host, so I want to defy borders as much as possible, especially as nationalism and xenophobia are on the rise around the globe. My own promise is to platform First Nations Australians in my curation, beginning with Blak Douglas, providing them a voice beyond Australia's borders that have often limited their reach. All this said, in recognition of Blak's presence in this episode, I want to state out loud what you can find in 5 a.m. Story Talk show notes. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Jara people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It will never be wholly comfortable for me or those who respect what was taken from the First Nations people to live and prosper on Australian soil until there is a proper treaty, but we can do our best to honor, respect, and learn from the land's traditional custodians in the meantime. We can also try to atone and heal. Okay. Let's talk about Blak a bit more now. I discovered his work after I returned to Australia. His painting, Moby Dickens, had just won the Archibald Prize, which is like winning an Oscar for artists here. You can go to his website, which you'll find a link to in the show notes, to check out this gorgeous portrait of artist Carla Dickens, as well as many other pieces. Blak's work is always colorful, informed by his graphic design training, and drowning in satire and cryptic symbolism that makes each piece something to interrogate and find endless meaning in. You'll also be hard-pressed to find one that isn't culturally and politically charged, as in-your-face, dangerous, and brutally honest as Blak is in the conversation you're about to listen to. You might say the art and the artist both demonstrate a great deal of fuck you moxie. I love it, and I hope you do too. Now, I want to warn you, and I hate that I have to warn you about this at all, because once upon a time, most of us could handle hearing and maybe even being challenged by other people's points of view. But Blak is going to bring up subjects that some of you will find provocative. Others might even consider some of what he says inflammatory. I don't know what to tell you, except get used to it here at 5 a.m. Story Talk. I'm not going to tell a colonized person living on land stolen from his people to censor himself about how he feels about what happens in his country. Nor am I going to silence what a victim of colonization has to say about the censorship of his speech when it comes to other groups around the globe he finds commonality with. I should also mention that Blak's going to use, in a historical context, a couple of derogatory terms sometimes flung at Aboriginal people and other Black people around the globe. These could startle some of you, so I want to flag that right now for those who might not be prepared for such words. Last contextual note. This conversation was recorded in May, just after the federal election here that saw the Labour Party absolutely smash the country's Conservative coalition. Blak will refer to the Liberal Party, which is, counterintuitively, a right, some might even say a far-right, political party, and Peter Dutton, whose name will also come up, was the dickhead who led them. He was such a great big morally rudderless dickhead, in fact, he not only lost the election for the party, he lost his own seat. Good one, Peter. So, still with me? I'm almost done, I promise. When this episode ends, you're going to want to stick around for the bonus episode, as always, because Blak is going to be back to discuss a seminal piece of art from his life, the 1966 Australian $1 banknote, which featured a design that stole the bark paintings of Aboriginal artist David Malangi. This one is a doozy, if only because it comes with an even deeper cultural history lesson about Australia than I've so far provided you here. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. If you have questions, drop a comment on this episode and I'll do my best to answer it. And don't forget, you can find links to everything discussed in today's episode, as well as to the 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter in the show notes. I think that's everything, right? If not, I'll cover it in the wrap-up. Now, let me introduce you to artist Blak Douglas. It's great to see you, Blak. I'm a huge fan. I've been very excited to talk to you about your art. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm enjoying a kind of a fruitful medley of artistic events in Sydney town, in Australia here, Gadigal land, acknowledging First Nations peoples here and First Nations people back home there as well. And so tonight I speak on stage at Parliament of New South Wales in Macquarie Street in Sydney, and I'll be interviewed by the former ABC radio show host Simon Marnie. I'm really looking forward to that. He's a very intelligent individual and recently departed the ABC. And so we're having a chat about art and pretty similar to what we're going to be talking about today, as I'll do. So just thanks for the rehearsal. And then tomorrow night is the big opening of the most famous art prize in Australia and one of the most famous art prizes in the world, and that's the Archibald Prize, of which, of course, this little black duck won 3 years ago. So it's taken me 3 years to come back and show my face, and that's because of a roller coaster of mixed emotions and politics and all of that stuff I'm sure we'll have a chat about later on.
All right. Well, I want to also start by saying I'm really disappointed I'm going to be missing the Halfway Line show at the Penrith National Regional Gallery. You grew up in Penrith. You became an artist there. How important was it for you to have this retrospective of your work there?
Yeah, so Penrith, for the viewers back home, Penrith is a city now in the west of Sydney, about 45 kilometres west of the centre of the CBD of Sydney. It's bounded by what we call in the Darug language, the Darubbin or the Nepean River, and that's the western border of the city itself. And so, look, to have a survey show back in my hometown, it's been long overdue and long awaited. And once again, political upheavals prevented me from having this show much earlier in my career. So what the survey show is about is it's a snapshot of 26 years of my art making career, which began in 1998 and out there in Penrith in Western Sydney. And so it's really nice to see that snapshot come to fruition in one gallery space. And also I've been quite taken aback with the numbers. It's broken all records of any exhibition that's ever been staged at that gallery, the Penrith Regional Gallery. And it's continued to do so. It's on until the 20th of July. It's already seen 10,000 visitors. So I never expected that in my hometown. Let me just paraphrase my hometown. It's a rugby league, sporting, blue collar, working class demographic, of which I led early, very early in my career, because as a First Nation descendant from this continent, it's about social justice and the effects of colonization on my Aboriginal people. It was short-lived of where I could possibly exhibit that work. And perhaps that's part of the reason why it's taken 20 years for it to be wholly embraced in my hometown.
I'm curious what your relationship to art was growing up, and when did you realize, sort of what was the moment when you realized you were going to be an artist and this was the rest of your life?
Great question. So I was raised watching my mother's brothers on the white side of my family. And I'll just do a brief introduction. My genealogy is made up of Irish, Scot, English, German, Aboriginal. And so the most percentage of the genealogy is Scottish. So I was watching my mother's brothers, the Brown brothers, they were known as Donald and Douglas Brown. And so they were arguably the most famous sign writers or coach painters on the continent in the 80s, back when everybody had a lot of money. I distinctly remember speedboats turning up from California to a little property in Blacktown in Western Sydney, at my grandmother's property where they worked out of their workshop. So watching their incredible artistry just about every day as I was babysat by my grandmother when mum went to work. And I just pestered them and asked too many questions, as kids do, continually asking why they're doing that, what they're doing. And I think at one point they gave me a little can of paint and a brush and said, go over and paint on that bit of metal there. And perhaps that was the beginning. I certainly knew it ran in the family, but very quickly I developed the ability to illustrate. If only I'd stuck with my entrepreneurial ways back then, when I realized I used to charge 5 cents for a title page at school on somebody's, when you used to, remember you used to have title pages in your books for your subjects. Now you have an illustrated page. Either that or I barter for some better lunch at recess or lunch, a better food products by illustrating people's things. So fast forward, it was 1996 and I was 26 years old and somewhat despondent, not knowing what career path to choose, because I certainly didn't want to be a football player. And I doodled away at these caricatures, developing my skills as an illustrator. And a suite of these caricatures, which were of elite Australian sports people at the time, and some international sports people as well. And they were produced on A3 cartridge paper with coloured pencil. And I've dug those out and they're on display in the exhibition there at Penrith at the moment, the first time in the public eye.
Fantastic.
So my father saw those caricatures when I was spending most of my hours at night in the spare room on a drawing table while my mates were out partying. And he said to me one time, why don't you do something with this, what you're doing, And there was an open day at University of Western Sydney. Mum took me up there on the weekend and I enrolled in a graphic design course, and the rest is history, I guess. Began painting as a hobby after that.
What's the ambition with the course? To do more advertising, something in a more, I guess, consistent career than being a freelance artist, essentially?
You're pretty much on it, because when we did the tour on the open day at the University of Western Sydney, we art is generally a very fashionable pursuit, isn't it? It resonates. It's just like there's something so fashionably trendy about being an artist. And I guess we can look at the Met Ball for the ultimate example of that. So once we got to the art block at the university and saw all the hairy arm-headed hippies smoking reapers out around the precinct, Dad said to me, well, you don't want to end up like them, do you? And so graphic design had a more of a, bespoke kind of chic vibe to it. And yes, I did think that I probably got more opportunity in landing a job in graphics than straight off the cuff becoming an artist. And hey, observing this whole landscape after almost 30 years of practice, it's certainly true that the sad indictment is that if you don't pick your institution of where you study, like an elite school or elite university or a college, then it's going to be a hard climb for you as an artist to get off the ground.
We should probably contextualize your early days as an artist with the personal journey you were on that at that time, given the fact that so much of your heritage shows up as part of the social justice component of your work. So I'd love to hear about your, I'm not even sure how to describe it, but your decision to dive into your Indigenous history as an Aboriginal man and that part of your family story.
Yeah, another great question. And to encapsulate that in a nutshell, when I entered university there, we had an Aboriginal education unit called Durali, and we were mentored or embraced by two female elders, and they were there particularly for the other First Nations students who might have travelled some distance to be at that university. That's always an issue for Aboriginal peoples to be away from home. So Auntie Jean South, she literally said to me that I was at a fork in the road. There I was in a monocultured, decidedly bigoted demographic post 1980. Things were starting to get a little bit better in the 90s through governance and in acceptance of Aboriginal people. And the fork in the road was that I'd grown up in that monocultured society, far distant from my own tribal homeland, which is the mid-north coast of New South Wales in a city called Kempsey, Dunghutti people, as did Dad, coming down to Sydney to seek work as an Aboriginal man. And then the fork in the road was, you need to trust your heart from here, because you're now in a place of learning and you're surrounded by egalitarian people, which is incredible. It was like a reverse jail, I think of it now. And so you look at a penitentiary and it's a place that houses the miscreants of society, whereas the other miscreants of society get to roam free and cause all sorts of white collar crime. But university in my hometown, as I'm sure it's for many people, you can incarcerate yourself amongst egalitarianism and broad-minded thinking. And I couldn't believe that existed in my hometown. Because outside of that, my dad would be called a bull or a nigger or whatever, derogatory terms. And you go inside and people aren't going to be like that. In fact, there's an Aboriginal education unit that embraces you and welcomes you and offers you that guidance. And so even attending the library there at university, and I saw my first images of artworks that were collected by the university hanging in the library of who would become my Aboriginal contemporary art mentors and inspirers. And these were highly politicized works hanging in the library. I just couldn't believe this stuff existed, or you could have this commentary. So very quickly I realized, hang on a minute, we're calling this place Australia. And for the first time, I saw the map of First Nations countries, the map of Aboriginal Australia, so cool. And I was looking at all these coloured splotches representing 300 diverse nations of people on this continent, which I didn't realise existed in that en masse. But why are we calling it Australia? And that's something I'm banging on about now with the kids when I workshop them in school in art. My presentations open with that map. And reminding them, we derive Australia from Australis, Terra Australis, which is a Latin term given to this continent. And like so many other names that we're left with, Sydney, for example, Viscount Sydney, 4,000 square kilometres after a podgy, disreputable London parliamentarian. Tell the kids in school, wouldn't you rather call it Wongal country, Darug country, Wonnarua, Cabradal, Barramadigal? These are beautiful names for your town that you live in. Don't call it Sydney. We've got to change this. And now we're living in an era we can do that. So very quickly, I grappled onto the fact that the least I can do is remind people of the illegal, illicit, historical patriarchy that has determined how we enact in our lives today.
What I find interesting is the systemic ignorance that existed about Aboriginal history, that you hadn't even seen a map of Aboriginal countries. You know, that the education system in Australia was so systemically racist still, that you could have Aboriginal history, ancestry, and only discover that in your 20s. I don't know if people outside of Australia realize how effective the system was at keeping people ignorant of the country's traditional custodians.
That's right. And that's a good point, because had I not have seen that map hanging in the office of the Aboriginal Education Unit, I would not have been completely captivated and enthralled about the beauty and diversity of these cultures, and the sad opposition by the likes of Peter Dutton, who thankfully walked away with his tail between his legs and not become almost the 30th liberal right-wing prime minister, white prime minister of this continent. We have immeasurable issues with the fallacies of education here, which sadly remains largely convened by the Catholic Archdiocese, which have actually come good in terms of their embracing of Aboriginal cultures, and now, thankfully, are one of the more reputable celebrators of Aboriginal cultures within the education department. However, you've got to look at the fact that we still have a fundamental Christian-based governance of how everything operates and is orchestrated on this continent today. So back to the map, 236 years ago, there were thousands of languages and a couple of million First Nations peoples roaming this beautiful land after a successive history of maintaining it since millennia. And we've reduced those languages to under 50 today. And so that's a pretty macabre issue to understand and embrace for kids in school, that's for sure. And I'm not going to dwell on the past, but as Dr. Charles Perkins, the eminent activist of the 70s and co-founder of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra, the nation's capital, as he said, we know we can't live in the past, but the past lives in us. And so it's about reminding and making sure that those mistakes aren't made again. And I don't want to bang on and dwell in that past. And I'm fully aware of the outcomes of evolution as we are as sapiens. But where it's preventable, it must be prevented. The genocides and the ill practices that continue, which are largely economic based on this continent and largely exclude the remaining First Nations people and survivors that are here today.
So after your encounter with that map, discovering a mentor that told you were at this fork in your life, what happened next to lead to, I think, 2014, you took on the professional name of Blak Douglas.
That's right. So born Adam Douglas Hill. The Douglas is the Scottish influence. The Hill is the English influence. And Adam was not my choice and has no biblical reference, I was told. Rather, I was named after the one of the hot brothers in Bonanza, who Mum took a liking to. So, anyway, what happened? Fast forward to the 2014 moniker, or the pseudonym, if you will. That purely came about because of two distinct reasons. One was that I'd already suffered immensely the effects of identity queries from both black and white fraternities. That is, that in the Aboriginal fraternity, as I started to develop an art name, the questions prevailed about, well, how black is he? Because back to what you said about the map, if I was raised in a predominantly Aboriginal community, a mission, if you will, as we often call them over here, I would have known quite distinctly that information. And so that can be used to be constituted against your Aboriginality. And so because I look like I do and not like my father, who was evidently Aboriginal stereotypically, I have to jump through all sorts of hoops to seek Aboriginal employment. So a fair-skinned person like myself, or a mixed blood, has to be provided with a certificate of Aboriginality, which you have to gain from a nominal Aboriginal land council or authorities in communities who accept your identity as being an Aboriginal person. So I had to do that back in the early days to seek such employment and to operate as I do today, really. And then, but I still continue today when I visit my Bogan brethren in the western suburbs, rednecks, you might say, back
Mm.
back in the States and whatnot,
Yes.
who are dear to me still because we're, somewhat birds of a feather in where we grew up together. But nonetheless, you can rest assured after one too many beers, someone's going to get a bit narky about the whole First Nations issue in Australia. And then I'm going to be the one that cops it. If I get introduced as an Aboriginal artist, well, it starts and it's just a domino effect and it goes on and you find yourself having to school people up and you never win. You never win the discussion because people are so ingrained from, which I do remind them if I do get a little bit hot under the collar, that your genealogy is directly related to thieves and miscreants of the early colony. So, I have to process all of that to be able to eloquently either deliver my defense or find my dignified escape out of the scenario.
Is that why you took the name Blak Douglas then?
The other reason, so sorry, yes, to finish off that one. So colloquially, we say in Aboriginal community, black fellas or white fellas, and famously sung by Uncle George and Warumpi Band, the epic song of the 1980s that should be sung at every sporting fixture and major event here by the crowd, black fella, white fella. And also BLAK, that word, which is, I guess, a funky, blackified hip-hop version of the general word black, which was coined by the late Destiny Deacon, who was one of my all-time great artistic inspirers. She coined that term. And so thereafter, you saw hip-hop artists using that word in their prints or whatever, and in lyrics and whatever. We often say BLAK. Douglas is the dominant genealogy of the European adoption. So Blak Douglas became that. And partly because I was also doing a lot of stage MC work, performative stuff. And there's a funny guy from Melbourne down your way who has his own TV show. And I was constantly getting mistaken for him, particularly at events. In fact, I recall emceeing a festival in Sydney, and some woman came up and looked at the program and looked up at me and said, "Oh, I thought you were Adam Hills, the comedian from Melbourne." And I couldn't live with that. And it got to the point where the analytics in Google in 2014, if you were looking for me, Adam Hill artist, Google would correct you and say, "Don't you mean the more famous guy, Adam Hills, with the S on the end of his name?" So I thought I'd go do something about this. And I just invented Blak Douglas to go by as a stage name.
It's a great name. I'm curious, because we talked a little bit about my own journey back to Australia at the beginning, before we actually started this podcast. How did your parents react to your search for identity in your 20s? One side of it was delving into your father's ancestry. Your mother, did she experience that as a rejection in any way?
Not particularly. It was my mum was just one of those incredibly egalitarian, loving individuals, human beings who embraced anyone really, and as did her mother. So I have a very strong maternal connection to my family. Dad was this hard-working black fellow who had to endure all sorts of taunts and things on the building site all his life, and wherever he went, from not being permitted to drink in pubs, in licensed venues from where he came from, coming to Sydney and experiencing the same thing, constantly being challenged for fights because everybody knows a black man pretty good with his fists and all of that sort of stuff. So ultimately, by the time I invented Blak Douglas, Mum had sadly passed, but she was embracing of what I did. They always supported me, whatever. Dad found it difficult to wholly embrace what I did because he pretty much had to, as most Aboriginal people did of the era, had to assimilate very quickly, or at least look as though you're assimilated. And by what I mean by that is that he unfortuitously fell into that right-wing kind of media demographic, as most tradies do. When you just got to listen to what a trade person plays in their car on the way to work and what they're listening to. And it's generally media that's significantly right-wing biased. And so when I started painting about social justice and the want for a more leftist view on what has become an ultra right wing nation, he would raise his eyebrows and wonder. And he said to me, he'd spent his life deflecting these attacks to create a little haven, a nest for myself and my mother in a monoculture community in Western Sydney. Why would I stir the hornet's nest? And that was an interesting thing. But when Auntie Jean South presented that book in the road to me, it was as though I got nudged forth by my ancestors standing behind me at that meeting. And they said, pretty much said, well, it's your turn to carry the fire stick on behalf of the clan. And so that's what's happened. That's what happened. Once you start the fire in the belly, once you get that nudge from the ancestors, then there's nothing greater to pursue. There's nothing greater to step up for.
There is something tragic, though, about your father being Aboriginal and you embracing that part of your identity, putting that into your art, and him being confused by it.
Yeah. Thing is that going back to the aforementioned about being decidedly brainwashed by right-wing media. And, we have a considerably right-wing blue-collar tabloid here called the Daily Telegraph. Telegraph. And we're not going to see, radiant stories about Aboriginal successes in society, but rather they'll latch on to the negatives and really drum that home to the point where when you get to those mentioned barbecues, people are just going to parrot fashion, repeat what they read in the Daily Telegraph that morning, or what they heard by the shock jocks on the radio about the problems with Aboriginal youth in Australia. And it's just fucking painful and tedious to have to stand there with guides that I've grown up with and say, yes, but you stole it, the whole place. And you're worried about an Aboriginal person getting slightly more benefit in social security payments than a white person.
I appreciate the observation about the Telegraph creating this sort of mono language for mostly white people in this country, but the far right, because before there was social media, when I first moved over here, it was astonishing that every single person's racism was expressed with the exact same language. It never changed. It was always, there was concern about immigrants. It was always, we just want them to embrace the Australian culture. We don't want them to force their ways on us. And I would think, who's forcing anything on you? But of course, it was language that was present in these newspapers. And it was so pervasive that they no longer had, I felt, thoughts of their own. They were just part of some sort of regurgitation machine. And to the degree, recently, somebody said some version of that to me again. And it was astonishing that 20 years later, the language was one or two words off, but the exact same statement, that it hadn't evolved even in 2 decades.
Look, that's a good point. And once again, it's a cultural amnesia. Perhaps it's a result of what developed as a rum colony in Australia, the rum rebellion, where payment was made in rum. So we didn't get off to a good start, considering that the first 11 ships dumped the absolute filth and bottom of the pile of London on these shores to create what is essentially most largely the population of Australia today. And so it's taken me quite a long time in my arts career, some 20 years of painting what began as quite edgy, fuck you political paintings. But now, and I do owe it to having read Yuval Harari's Sapiens.
Excellent book.
Which has given me a refreshing take on where we are as humanity and as a species that dominate the planet. Because if I hadn't have read that and read some dark yet eloquent reminders and quotes, i.e., genocide is the dark side of evolution, I wouldn't have an understanding and appreciation for why do liberals think that way, that we must seek to immediately extract all of the resources from Aboriginal lands without paying much in return to society as a whole via taxes, or to the Aboriginal peoples of the land that we're stealing the resources from and sending offshore to China. And so, there's a reason why they were sent here to colonize this land. And it's very easy as a young upstart to just be completely defiant and want to make spears and throw at people, which they prevented our warriors from doing 180 years ago. But you have to understand, well, okay, there's a reason why the royal family have become one of the most dominant sapient families on the planet, because they had that prerogative to extract resources and capitalize in a monetary fashion. So it's sad being caught in this banana republic, as Paul Keating put it, down here in Australia, where not many people take too seriously, save for investors in our offshore supplies. But other than that, particularly when it comes to art and speaking out about these things, what we find is that there are too many gatekeepers that now prevent such commentary from making its way off this continent, particularly in visual form, visual art. And I got to say, it is exciting to be speaking to you today about this subject, because you're a voice that allows, an unquarantined, unscrutinized passage to the world.
I've read you advise kids to vent their frustrations on the canvas, and there's power in that because it engages and provokes. But what does it do for your mental health? And is there ever a negative blowback from so much fuck you, which sometimes I experience? I realize I'm spending so much time saying fuck you that I get lost in it a little bit.
That's a great question. And ultimately, what I try to impress on particularly young Aboriginal youth who might be headed down that despondent pathway is that we have every opportunity today to exhibit, or within reason, perhaps not in the, let me put this into a nutshell. The art institutions here are governed by old money or influential money. And I'll get to that one a little in a moment. So outside of that, though, there are so many opportunities to exhibit your commentary on a wall and be celebrated for that and receive a pat on the back for your commitment to social justice or your political statement in society. Very thankful that we can do that here in what is called Australia, as opposed to Ai Weiwei trying to do that in China and getting beaten up and other artists from other right-wing countries where you are not permitted to make those comments. So we can do that here, and thank goodness that we can do that. And I wish that more of these celebrated contemporary Aboriginal artists could have an unabated passage to the rest of the world that isn't quarantined or scrutinized by certain gatekeepers that are the people that make the decisions about where things go. And I guess the worst case, the hot topic here right now is what transpired with the main artistic funding body in Australia versus the Lebanese artist Khaled Sabsabi, who has a career of 30 years, an internationally celebrated artist who, like a few other artists, made the fateful error of commenting on Palestine. Right now in Australia, I can make any untoward comment about the Commonwealth and the governments of Australia, but make one comment about Palestine and you can potentially end your artistic career. And that's because of the influence that peoples have on the way arts operate here in Australia. And that's a pretty daunting prospect. And many of us artists who are known for our political comment, and many of us who have vocally supported our support for Palestinians, are now wondering about, will we have a job to go to, or will we find a dealer that is willing to represent us next week?
I'm a screenwriter and novelist. I don't understand enough about the gatekeepers you're describing and their role in essentially shutting down a career locally as you're describing it, but also their role in preventing work from traveling around the world. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
So there are about 5 commercial galleries on this continent. They are a gallery that represents artists who exhibit commercially, and only 5 out of a multitude that have significant international authority. There is probably one who is the greatest known of those galleries, which is Rosalind Oxley Gallery in a uptown suburb in Sydney called Paddington. So, for example, the stats came out a few years ago. The biggest art exhibition on the planet is the Venice Biennale. 7 of the last 10 represented artists at the Venice Biennale were Rosalind Oxley artists. So that means that pretty much because of her wealth and status, not only in art, but also as a society member, she has made those international contacts. And it's, as I say to the students who might study at a reputable art college in Sydney, if you're lucky enough to get picked up straight out of art school by Rosalind Oxley, well, you can pretty much just mortgage yourself to the hilt, because you'll have a fruitful career from there on. It's different for the rest of us who might have made one too many political comments in their artistic career to appear as be too hard to sell, because it's become known that the institutions do not want angry urban Aboriginal art hanging on their wall. As we've seen recently at the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra, the mothership, if you will, a artwork featuring a tapestry artwork featuring a Palestinian flag was censored. It was simply taped over by the curators of the gallery because it's too, you can't go there. And so I learned that the hard way myself, and by creating a graphic, a very edgy graphic, which featured the Israeli flag with a photoshopped image of Netanyahu. And I was berated vehemently by several influential peoples of institutions here, and lost 200 followers overnight. It's like the worst wildfire that gets out of control you could ignite. And I think I'm still hearing backlash about that today.
Has there been any other event in the past 25 years that has similarly silenced artists in this country?
No,
Hmm.
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. It's certainly the worst in my lifetime in relations to the hostilities of an other. But I'm sure I might not be up to date on that, but it's never been as abrasive as what we've seen in recent times.
Hmm.
And it's a pretty daunting thing. And it's not right. And I had to remind one of those people that did berate me on social media that I don't believe that technically, culturally, you have the authority to put me in my place on my own country, on my own land.
Even now, saying these things in a podcast conversation like this, you seem committed to the risk.
Bro, I have no way to go.
You came for a serious conversation, and I appreciate that. Wow. Thank you for all of that. At this point, how do you feel about your future as an artist in Australia, your potential for success outside of Australia, given everything you've described, but also just the state of the arts in general in 2025 and going forward, which as we discussed earlier, feels dire, whatever medium you're working in.
Yeah, I don't sit before you with a lot of faith about my personal artistic future here. And because I've still to this day not found the absolute home representative entity in a commercial gallery. I could colloquialize it and say that realistically, this place is still a cottage lane industry art market. And that's what my hometown was back in the 80s. Cottage lane means those nice little paintings of a brook running through a field of poppies and a little farmhouse over yonder with maybe a horse and a nobleman and so forth in the landscape. It still feels like that's what this place realistically is, and particularly after what we've just discussed, it doesn't seem that you can't walk into a major institution here, and we'll take it off me and my political views for a moment, and you won't walk into the institution here and see a famous Jeff Koons photographic spread feature of him and La Cicerona, if people don't remember those famous series that he took when he was partnered with the porn star actress who wanted to run for government in Italy. Famous, beautiful, kind of formatted seaside frolicking of those two naked and copulating you won't see that kind of imagery in an institution here. This place, it's a nation of teenagers searching for an identity after 236 years. It hasn't grown up. This kind of man-child landscape that we can't, tripping too much over our religious beliefs, even today, to be able to walk into a gallery that can openly display nudity or, nobody yet as an artist has painted a gigantic massacre scene of what happened only 180 years ago on this continent. So my faith isn't fruitful about the immediate future of art, particularly given that our funding bodies are the Australian government, and we've seen what has just happened with, as I mentioned, Khaled Sabzadi. The groundswell here, the murmurs on the ground here are quite dire for artists. But if you're a cottage lane industry artist and you paint still life arrangements of flowers on a table, then you've got every reason to expect a fruitful future as an artist here. And sadly, that's not me, and it aches me that we have to exist within such a conservative environment here.
Thank you, Blak, for giving me so much to think about. It's been a really exciting, it was a very powerful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
As for you listening, wherever you are today, thanks so much for spending this time with me here at 5 a.m. Story Talk. If you enjoyed this episode, can you do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating or a thumbs up wherever you're listening to it? It makes a huge difference to the fates of new podcasts like this one. I know you might be thinking of hitting stop now, chat's wrapped up and all, but you don't want to go just yet, trust me. As promised, there's a bonus episode to come. Blak returns to discuss a seminal piece of artwork from his life, the 1966 Australian $1 banknote, which featured a design that stole the bark paintings of Aboriginal artist David Malangi. Might sound like a crazy pick, but I assure you, the conversation is going to blow your mind. It concerns the first Aboriginal copyright dispute in Australia's history. To listen to this bonus episode, though, you're going to need to become a paid subscriber to this podcast if you aren't already. Alternatively, you can head to the show notes and subscribe to my 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter, where you'll get access to all of my podcast episodes days, weeks, and sometimes even months early, including every bonus episode like the one I'm discussing. You'll also get access to a ton of other arts articles, most of them focused on screenwriting and writing, many of them exclusive to paid subscribers. Upcoming guests of this podcast include Good Luck to You, Leo Grand, director Sophie Hyde, DEI pioneer and former Warner Brothers Senior Vice President of DEI for North America, Karen Horn, and Dr. Sareka Davies, historian and author of the brilliant new book, Humans, A Monster's History. And next week, I'll be joined by my old friend, Mike Richardson, the founder and CEO of Dark Horse Comics. Thanks again for listening. See you at the bonus episode for some more 5 a.m. Story Talk with artist and rabble-rouser Blak Douglas.